Welcome to Let's Talk with me, Sally Lockwood, my weekly show where we do a deep dive into one of the big global news stories of the week, speaking to some of the people living the headlines. And this week we're going to be talking about Gaza because it does feel like we're inching slightly closer towards some sort of a breakthrough when it comes to a ceasefire. But the reality on the ground couldn't feel more different. And my guest today is someone who understands that far better than most. Jonathan Fowler, he's the spokesperson for UNRWA, that's the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Let's bring Jonathan in. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, thank you very much indeed for having me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for finding time for us. It certainly does sound, when you listen to the noises coming out of Washington, that there could be some sort of a breakthrough in the next few days, certainly the next week when it comes to a ceasefire. What are you hearing, and will that impact the amount of aid getting into Gaza?
I mean, we're hearing the same reports, elements of information, all kinds of things that everyone else is. Like the rest of the United Nations system, we've appealed from the very beginning for this war to stop. It was shown the last time there was a ceasefire what the international humanitarian aid family, including the UN, was able to do to actually scale up aid and bring it in. And that really has to be our first priority, is to save lives. The guns need to fall silent. They need to fall silent long term, but in the short term, the priority is going to be getting aid to people that need it.
I've actually spoken to Palestinians in Gaza who described that ceasefire earlier this year in January through to early March, how transformative it was in terms of how they were living. What they need now, though, is far more aid than is getting in. We've been hearing so much about that. And is there any indication at this stage that you're aware of as part of the UN family who focus on aid and humanitarian needs? Is there any suggestion at this stage that you will be able to increase the amount of aid you're able to get in if there is a new ceasefire?
It remains incredibly unclear on that front, and that in itself is a problem. I mean, we're always standing ready to spring into action as soon as we can. I mean, that's what we do, in humanitarian work, and we do that around the globe. Aid operations are often big, they're often extremely complex, but they're kind of well-oiled machines based on a set of rules. At the start of the war, there was a period where there was a total siege on aid for a handful of weeks, basically, and we saw the consequences of that already. But and then aid was able to trickle in, and then there was this huge scale up during the ceasefire, indeed. But the total siege, the total ban on aid that was imposed at the beginning of March, I mean, that has had horrific human consequences. And what's been done, this Israeli-American mechanism, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to try to sort of replace the UN system. I mean, it's not doing at the scale required. I'm not saying it should, because it's counter to international humanitarian law, but the consequences, and then the little aid that is getting in and has been getting in for a number of weeks, I mean, it just means that the needs are so incredibly huge now that what we're going to have to be able to do and do immediately is just enormous. I mean, the biggest we could ever possibly imagine. But the problem is we have no clarity. And I mean, there are certain indicators, of course, in news reports that there's some kind of intent to try to increase the role of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And I want to emphasize, just putting the name humanitarian in the name of something doesn't make it compatible with international humanitarian law. But what will the UN be able to do? We must be able to do our job of work. I mean, it's as simple as that.
For people who aren't as familiar with the aid situation in Gaza as you and me, there was an 11-week blockade after the ceasefire ended. Essentially, no aid got into Gaza. And then just over a month ago, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was established, which is this controversial new way of delivering aid to Palestinians in Gaza, and it's backed by the US and Israel. Just explain to me what impact this new aid mechanism has had on Palestinian civilians in terms of how they're able to get access to food and feed their families?
It's incredibly negative. Of course, some people would argue, well, some aid is better than no aid. And, that is a point of view. But the point is that this is I mean, it's a sort of death trap, Hunger Games situation. I mean, for a number of reasons. For example, the way the UN system works is to go to where people are that need aid. I mean, so people might have to walk a little bit to come to UN distribution points. But the point is that the UN was operating when we were able to operate fully, around there were about 400 aid distribution points, and around 100 of those were specifically UNRWA ones. But I mean, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has about 4, 5, something like that. These so-called aid hubs, as they're referred to. But what this means is that people have to go incredibly far to reach aid. So that's the people who are physically able. And let's not forget, this is in a situation where there's a lot of malnutrition, huge number of, the largest number of child amputees in the world. Bereaved families, widows, elderly people, what about the people who cannot get to these aid distribution points? So you've got that issue. The kind of aid that is being brought in terms of food is not nutritionally balanced in the way that a UN aid basket, an aid parcel is. So there's that. And the fact that, the sort of securitization, the involvement in this aid operation of a party to a conflict, that's what goes against international humanitarian law. So it's not functioning in the interests of the population. People are going to these aid distribution points, and they are losing their lives. They're shooting at these distribution points, masses of injuries. They don't even, frankly, as far as we can tell, know even to whom they're giving the aid to. Where's it going? So, in other words, if somebody comes and says, I have a family of 10, they're not relying on any kind of registration system in the way that the UN does. I want to emphasize to the audience, the UN operations involves total custody of the aid chain from, A to Z. That means that we know precisely to whom we are giving aid. The number of people in a family, if somebody comes on their own to collect it, we know how many people for whom they're collecting aid.
As you say, hundreds of people have reportedly been killed trying to reach these aid distribution sites. 2 US contractors who are part of the security detail protecting these sites have spoken to the Associated Press. You've probably seen the report, to say that they've shot at Palestinian civilians trying to get aid. Israeli soldiers have also said something similar to Haaretz newspaper, that they've been ordered to disperse Palestinians crowding, trying to reach aid, even when they present no threat and they're unarmed. Hundreds of people have lost their lives with this new rollout of aid. For those who choose not to go to one of these distribution sites because they're too fearful or it's too unsafe, what are their options for getting food if they don't go to one of these sites?
Little or nothing. It's as simple as that. I mean, the F word in this basically is famine. And it's often too late when a formal classification of famine comes in. We hear stories like if somebody has a tiny handful of flour, people are grinding it up with dirt to make some kind of, slightly bigger bread, doing what they can find, eating, grass and things like that. Or, people are maybe trying to grow a few little vegetables or herbs or something, whatever they can do. But yet people do have nothing.
Are we at that point yet? Even if it hasn't officially been labelled it, is Gaza in a state of famine?
What's happening on the ground looks like it, feels like it. Whether or not it's formally classified in the technical sense as one, that sadly is often done after the event. And so really the real story here is to stop what is happening here and now from happening.
Absolutely. Stop wrangling over terminology and just look at the images. They tell you what you need to know. Jonathan, is any UN aid getting in at the moment?
There is some. I mean, there have been some agencies, World Health Organization's been able to get stuff in, some medical supplies, this kind of thing. It's extremely limited. Of course, when nothing gets in and then you suddenly hear that 6 trucks have been able to get in, that is something to be glad about. But we've come to the point where we're celebrating the entry of 6 trucks. And that's what we've been pushed to.
Sorry, for context, what was it before the war broke out? It was, 900 a day or something, was it?
The sort of benchmark, as it were, during the ceasefire was around 600 trucks a day to meet the minimum survival level of the population, not, sort of to make everything wonderful and perfect. So there, you can do the maths. If we suddenly see 6. And the problem is, of course, expressing stuff in truckloads was also quite misleading because some of the restrictions imposed by Israeli authorities included requiring trucks to arrive at the Gaza Strip half empty because it's easier to inspect a truck when it's not completely full. Put it that way.
Interesting. I did not know that.
That means if you say, like, here's 10 trucks, that's actually 5 fully loaded trucks. And of course, the other requirement was that the trucks had to arrive at the inspection points at Kerem Shalom, be inspected, offloaded, loaded onto other trucks to be then distributed to warehouses within the Gaza Strip. And then, gradually spread out across the network. So it's not as if, when we talk about numbers of trucks, as this highway of trucks flowing into the Gaza Strip. It's incredibly complicated, and so much of this complication is, it's a policy decision, it's a human policy decision to do things in a certain way.
One of the reasons the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was set up is because Israel claimed that Hamas was looting so much of the aid that was coming in to Gaza before. The UN has obviously disputed that and said, it was negligible amounts. But what more context can you give in response to that claim by Israel?
Yes, this is an important question. We absolutely dismiss those kind of claims. You hear, I was in a TV interview the other day. They had some spokesperson from, I think, retired, or from the Israeli military. I forget the name, but I was asked by the interviewer. This person from the military has said all aid was being looted, was being sort of stolen by Hamas. Well, that kind of outlandish rhetoric. Surely anybody saying that must know it's complete nonsense. You can't say something like all aid was being looted. Now look, this is a war zone. This is complete anarchy. There is no law and order in the Gaza Strip. Nobody can give a 100% guarantee that a party to the conflict, an armed group, be that Hamas or another one, may or members of it, individual members, their families, may not get their hands on something. But the important point, and we live in this world where there's no possibility to somehow appreciate shades of grey. You cannot guarantee something 100%. But what we can say is there was no evidence of any kind of systemic or systematic looting of aid by Hamas or any of the other armed groups. So you have to ask yourself, what is this all about? Well, as I mentioned previously, the UN has total custody over the chain of aid. We know who it's going to. Supposedly, this GHF is a solution to a problem, and yet, they don't do robust ID checks like international humanitarians from the UN did. They don't really know who they're giving aid to or anything. And so, in a sense, they've framed themselves as a solution, but it's like they're a solution in search of a problem. But in fact, they may even be creating the problem that they purported to come in to solve, and that's quite incredible when you think about it, because it's like a rhetorical device almost, which is playing with people's lives. It's incredibly dystopian. I used the term Hunger Games before, but it's when you see these people lining up, and then it's almost like the go, get the aid, people getting trampled, people getting shot at. It's like something from, a streaming series or something.
Yeah, the images are truly distressing. Has the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation extended an invitation to work with the UN directly? And if they did, would the UN accept?
They've briefed the United Nations. That has been somehow framed as an invitation to work with the UN. There was recently a briefing organised in Israel by this foundation for UN officials. But of course, it's just a briefing. It's a kind of, here's what we're doing kind of thing. Well, yes, thank you, but this doesn't make any of this in any way compatible with international humanitarian law, all the principles I cited earlier, nor does it make it effective.
Earlier on in the war, the UN was doing aid drops to get certain aid into Gaza. Why have they stopped?
Okay, this was actually member states that were doing this. There was a number of member states. Look, I mean, aid drops are used in some humanitarian operations, but of course at the time we were asked, why isn't this something that is being done at scale by the United Nations system? One of the reasons is that they are not effective because, at the same time that people were saying all aid is being taken by Hamas, often these were the same people advocating for aid drops. And it's like you don't know who on earth, stuff, whose hands it gets into when it's dropped like that. The other thing is they're actually dangerous for people on the ground. Let's not forget this is a very urbanized area. I mean, we saw people being killed, because they were trying to get there first to get stuff. The point was, this isn't an island. This is a blockaded piece of land which has land right next to it. So you could just allow, gates to be opened and aid to flow in. It's a choice. And then, these alternatives, aid drops, seaborne aid, these kind of things were just sort of a distraction, again, from the fact that trucks could just come in. You've got aid sitting outside the Gaza Strip, you've got the capacity to bring it in, and yet, no, we need to do aid drops much better. And the amount you can drop from planes is actually much smaller as well. So none of this was, it was just a distraction, quite frankly.
Yeah, and I actually remember at the time hearing from an aid worker on the ground in Gaza who told me that an airdrop containing morphine just smashed when it landed. So it's hardly an ideal way of getting aid in. Regarding the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and what we were just discussing, how are relations between the UN and Israel? Have they broken down to an extent through this period?
I mean, look, this is a complicated one. I mean, it kind of depends where you look, because, of course, if you look on social media or you look at public statements, the condemnation of the international system, the utter rejection of international humanitarian law, the dehumanization of the population from, people who should know much, much better. All of that is very, very problematic. The personal attacks, on senior UN officials. And then, of course, against my agency, UNRWA specifically, the legislative moves, based on all kinds of thinking, if we can describe it that. There was a legislative move at the end of last year to ban our operations outright in East Jerusalem, because occupied East Jerusalem, is deemed by Israel to be part of its sovereign territory. And then to ban all contact between Israeli officials and UNRWA in anywhere else. Now, of course, that has had a major impact on our work in the Gaza Strip, because you can't have contact with one of the parties to a conflict, and a particularly significant party. That makes it much harder. Because let's not forget, in the Gaza Strip, we are, as I said, the largest humanitarian agency from the United Nations. Our footprint is so huge.
And just explain kind of what that looked like before the war. How involved was UNRWA in just running basic daily needs for Gazans?
We have a very specific mandate in the United Nations system. We were created as a response to the refugee crisis caused by the war of 1948, basically. People driven from their homes, this idea will apply models to sort of do relief and works. UNRWA, so the RW stands for relief and works in our name, and the concept was, provide relief and public works, a kind of Great Depression style solution, temporarily until such time as people can actually return to their homes. It's pretty sort of, it's a solution of its time. Now what happened was, of course, that this refugee crisis has not gone away. It's the most intractable refugee crisis in modern history. We're still here 75 years later, not because we want to be, but because, the issue that we deal with has not been resolved. Now, we have 13,000 operational staff in the Gaza Strip. Now, tragically, more than 300 of them have been killed since this war broke out. And, that's unprecedented. It's an unprecedented death toll for United Nations personnel. And, of course, we've suffered constant reputational attacks based on mis and disinformation, and that has affected our funding. There's donors, notably the United States, pulled the funding, and that's made our operations, the sustainability of our operations, incredibly complicated at this critical moment.
I was actually going to get onto that. So just for people who don't know the history, a report by Israel found that 10 members of UNRWA were working with Hamas. And this report came out after October the 7th. Those members of staff were fired. 2 of them had already been killed, as I understand it. And subsequent to that report, donors such as the United States, the UK and other European countries withdrew their funding for UNRWA. What impact has that had on you and the work that you're doing?
We were at the point basically of collapse, and that's awful. When you think about, you have a mandate to do a job of work from the UN General Assembly, and then suddenly, the rug is pulled from under you and you can't do it anymore. Now, very quickly, donors started to come back. They realized that they'd made a mistake, most of them. The United States was the only holdout, but beyond that, we've seen individual giving unprecedented for this organisation. I mean, a sort of silver lining within the crisis. But what does the situation mean for our work currently? I mean, we're living hand to mouth. In financial terms, it's month by month. And given what we are mandated to do, which is to provide public-like services for Palestine refugees until such time as there is just and lasting solution to their plight, that is bad. Because that means we're constantly in a situation on the cusp almost of having to make very difficult choices, like we've already got schools running on double shifts, morning and afternoon, and school classes are very large. What do we have to do next? Do we have to say we do one less day of education a week?
Briefly on that, are schools functioning in Gaza at the moment? And if they are, in what form?
So formal schooling had to cease at the start of the war, for the safety of the children, but also because our installations were all transformed into emergency shelters for the populations. So the schools are not operating, but what we were able to do last year was launch what we call back to learning. So it wasn't back to school as such, but this was activities like basic numeracy, literacy, art classes, art therapy, play activities. At the height of those operations during the ceasefire, we were able to bring this to around 50,000, 60,000 children. And then the numbers have oscillated since the ceasefire collapsed, but we're still doing this. I mean, this may seem surprising to people, but we've still got several thousand children benefiting from these activities. But this isn't education, but it's when you consider we had sort of 300,000 or so children in our school system in the Gaza Strip before the war, it's clearly not enough. But we've got to do everything we can, even if it's just even if it were just education for one child. That's the risk of a lost generation is so high.
There are suggestions from critics of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that they are concentrating Palestinians in Gaza in the south of the territory because the long-term goal for Israel would be to relocate Palestinians out of Gaza into other countries. Donald Trump has also floated that idea. How much concern is there that could happen, especially with this new ceasefire deal potentially in the offing?
I mean, we follow the news on this, and the United Nations system overall said that the forced displacement is not something that is acceptable in any way, shape or form.
For people who don't understand Gaza and the sensitivities and the history as well as you do, I have heard fairly educated people say, well, why wouldn't they want to move somewhere else? What would you say to that?
I mean, look, if somebody wants to move somewhere else, that's different. Yes, I mean, inevitably, there will be people who might want to rebuild their lives somewhere else. But this idea that somehow you sort of pick the population up and, plant them somewhere else, these are people, they're not building blocks.
Jonathan, on that note, we'll say goodbye. I can hear the call to prayer. I think it's at your end in Amman, not here. So perhaps a good time to wrap. But thank you so much for joining me today and talking through all of this. It's been a really important insight. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
So that was Jonathan Fowler, the spokesperson for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. A real insight, and it feels like we're going to get some news on this ceasefire in the next few days, maybe by the time this is published. But certainly at the time of recording, there's no breakthrough on a ceasefire yet. But what is clear is that the situation on the ground is absolutely horrendous. I will keep covering this story, and thanks to you so much for supporting this new programme and watching. If you've enjoyed the coverage and you want to see more, please hit subscribe, like the show, leave a comment, share it with your friends, let me know what you'd like to hear more of, and I'll see you next week. Thanks so much.